I think when I'm, when I finish my career as a therapist, I'm just going to work on prison masculinities. But Terry is really quite amazing, and has had a wonderful, wonderful career. He's trained as a psychiatrist, and for those of us who are sociologists, I would say he's like a social psychiatrist, in the sense that he doesn't simply see social problems in psychiatric terms to be dealt with medically, or even through a kind of individual therapy, but rather as social problems. I guess that's the fair thing to say. And so he's been very involved in questions about prison masculinity for some time. He edited a book with Don Sabo and Willie London, who was at the time incarcerated at Attica, wasn't he?
That's right.
So that one of his co-editors was in fact an African-American man who was incarcerated. And he's always been interested in not simply what brings men into prison, but what happens to them in prison. And that's kind of what he's going to talk about today. What actually happens to men when they go to prison. So prison as the cause of problems as opposed to the solution to problems. I won't say any more. I'm going to leave the floor to Terry, but I'm really, really grateful that you were able to come and be with us on your little whirlwind New York book tour. Oh, and I'll let you all know he recorded Leonard Lopate, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's like the book show on NPR here in New York. The only book show where the host actually reads the books. So it was recorded yesterday, but I'll let you know when it'll air. So we'll put that out.
Thank you, Michael. Michael and I met in the 80s, I guess, in the pro-feminist men's movement. And Michael was a real leader and sort of did the academic wing of our men's work. And the pro-feminist men's movement was a reaction to feminism, the second wave women's movement. And it was all about, what's our part in all this? How would we, if we're against sexism and against homophobia and against racism, what are we supposed to do? And we had to invent that. And I think we're at another moment like that where we need to invent it again. Let me start. I'm a psychiatrist, as Michael said. I'm very interested in social issues. In the Wright Institute, where I teach, we have a notion of clinician to society. And that is that we're usually treating individuals or groups. But really, the problems of the individuals and the groups are social. And we need to keep an eye on what's going on socially and do something to affect the social underpinnings of the personal and group problems. And that's called clinician to society. It's a concept of Nevitt Samford, who was a social psychologist back in the 50s and 60s. And he started the Wright Institute. I have a few underlying premises which I will lay out quickly, but they underlie all of my work as a forensic psychiatrist. Besides practicing psychiatry, I testify in court, usually about jail and prison-related, either something about conditions of confinement, which are cruel and unusual and therefore unconstitutional, or about mental health care. There's a huge proportion of prisoners with serious mental illness, or about sexual abuse, which is one of the places where I bring in gender studies quite a lot. First principle that underlies my work is that prison is not a place apart. We like to think about lock them up and throw away the key. They're going somewhere, it's out there somewhere, we're never going to visit it, we don't know what's going on in it. And when the society does that, what tends to happen is the problems of the society get disappeared into the prison, and awful abuses happen. Dostoevsky said this, that if you want to know about a society, go into its prisons. Second, racism. Our criminal justice system is all about racism. I recommend strongly Michelle Alexander's book, where she summed it up, The New Jim Crow. But the criminal justice system has an incredible history of racism, and it continues right into the prisons. So that African American, particularly young males, are much, much more frequently arrested. When they get arrested, they're more likely than their white counterparts jail. Whereas the white kid is going to be sent home and sent into therapy, the black kid is going to go into jail. Then they're going to be tried, they're going to have inadequate representation. On average, they're going to get longer sentences by far than white counterparts who are doing the same crime. Then when they get to prison, the same thing continues. So that in prison, the discipline system is going to mirror the criminal justice system at large. So that in my work, which is largely lately about solitary confinement, and I'll talk some about that, a huge proportion of people in solitary confinement are African American. In New York, it's 59%. Two things about this. One is that the more secretive an institution or facility is, the more abuse occurs there. That public notice is one of the best counters to abuse. And when the public doesn't notice an institution, this was true of the mental asylums back in the 40s and 50s, and it's true in the jails and prisons today. Without public notice and without someone caring about what goes on, it tends to happen, and human beings are like this. It was proven in the Stanford mock prison experiment in the early 70s, that when one group has massive control over another group, and the group that's under their control has no recourse, in law we call that due process, and the entire drama happens in secret, then terrible abuse happens. And in the Stanford mock prison experiment, it was a two-week experiment that had to be stopped in a few days because students who were subjects were either acting as a guard or acting as an inmate in prison. And the guards became so abusive towards the students, their peers, who were playing prisoners, that they had to stop the experiment. That happens behind bars, and that's why I'm on a campaign. My book is called Solitary: The Inside Story of Superman's Isolation and How We Can Abolish It, published by University of California Press last month, and I'm on a tour right now about that book. The other thing that happens when we don't count the prisons as part of our society but treat them as a place somewhere else is that we miss the main dynamic that's going on in criminal justice, and what I describe as disappearing. Our society has had a history. We more or less take care of disadvantaged people. In some periods of history, we're very interested in taking care of them, like the New Deal or the war on poverty. It's a period of history where the society is generous and public programs are set up, for instance, a social service safety net. In other periods, those programs are taken away, and it has to do with a cultural milieu in which there's less generosity and less caring. From the 70s until now, we've entered a period like that. If you look at community mental health as an example, which happens to be my field, in '63, President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act, which funded public clinics in the community to take care of the most seriously disturbed people who happen to be the lowest income people. And so we had private mental health services. Over the years since then, if you watch the kind of services that are available in the budgeting, that system has been dismantled. So there's been an incremental shrinking of the public mental health budget. Meanwhile, interestingly enough, the prison population has expanded probably 10 times by today since the early 70s. The official report is 7 times, but I think it's closer to 10. But geometrically, it's been expanded. The proportion of people in the prisons with serious mental illness has increased all the while. So with geometric expansion of the population, we also have an increase in the proportion with serious mental illness. If you look at the budget of mental health care in corrections, everybody thinks, well, they're going to jail or prison, they'll get treatment there. The budget has not expanded relatively. I mean, it's a little, with inflation and such, there's a little more money, but we're talking about many times over the number of people with serious mental illness behind bars. They're not getting mental health care, adequate mental health care. In the correctional system. Now, I call that a disappearing. Here's my interpretation. We as a society do not have the will to take care of the disadvantaged among us. We can't stand to see them in our presence suffering. For instance, homeless people, or there's a large proportion of people who are homeless. So we have what Jürgen Habermas calls a legitimation crisis. That is, we think we live in a democracy. We have some vague notion that democracy, besides being about voting, is also in some degree about equity. And that the gap between the rich and the poor in our society is actually a contradiction to some of our notion of democracy. And we're ambiguous about that. We don't have a clear idea about how much democracy depends on equity. But we can't stand to see people suffering in front of our eyes, so we lock them up. Here comes the saying, lock them up and throw away the key. We disappear people into prison who we as a society do not have the will to care for. So that's what I think is going on with the way what's secret in prison and how there's so little attention to what's going on. Michael and other academic gender studies folks have evolved a term called hegemonic masculinity. As we have all kinds of masculine notions of masculinity among us, but there's a generally pervasive notion that sort of takes control, and it's sort of the prototype. I won't get into this in great detail, but it's sort of the notions we have in common about masculinity. For instance, I think we'd all agree that compared to women, men have few friends and tend to keep their cards close to their chest. And the men's movement of the 80s challenged that and said, actually, that's not real healthy. That men who keep their cards close to their chests and have few friends are not living as good quality of life as they might be. But that's something we think about as sort of being part of masculinity. That's the hegemonic masculinity. Now in prison, I call this toxic masculinity. That is, the same things, the same characteristics that we were described to have hegemonic masculinity on the outside, in prison become magnified and exaggerated. So I think what we have in prison is toxic masculinity, which I define this way. The constellation of socially regressive male traits that serve to foster domination, the devaluation of women, homophobia, and wanton violence. That's toxic masculinity as practiced or as obvious in our prisons and jails. This notion is being contested today. I'd love to see it. You know, I think we're in a very dark period with Trump and the whole federal administration. They're just taking apart all of the positive things our government stands for. But I attribute to Trump a gift, which is organizing the left. I have never been to meetings since the 60s that are as crowded as Our Revolution, Indivisible, Stand Up for Social Justice, community meetings that usually would involve 3 or 4 people are now in 30 or 40 people. They have to find new chairs to bring in because everybody wants to do something about the awful things going on. Well, there's another contradiction to look at, and that is we've elected a president who admitted to groping and is proud of his homophobia and his racism, overt racism, xenophobia, his anti-immigrant. He just is proud of it. He's totally non-conscious about how awful what it is he stands for is. Meanwhile, with that kind of a shadow over us, we have a Me Too phenomenon. I mean, in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein revelations, we have women all over the place stepping forward and saying, that happened to me too. And then we have a whole lot of strong people, including our women senators, saying, well, this is not okay. And that we have to do something else about our culture rather than making it a given that men grope women like our president does. So we have a new level of culture war. And I think a big question, and I hope this is a question, I know it is in the Center for Study of Men and Masculinity, is what are the men going to do about this? You know, and I'm going to give some parallels. One of the things that I think happens in prison is that prison is a mirror of our social relations. I testify in cases about the sexual abuse of women. In men's prisons, sexual abuse is usually prisoner on prisoner. And there are fights, there are rapes, etc., sex slaves. In women's prisons, it's staff abusing women. Typically, not always, but typically, male staff with female prisoners. And there's a blue code. The blue code is that staff in a prison, officers in particular, do not snitch on each other. They will not talk about what happened. We have that in the Black Lives Matter situation out in the community. Police will not testify against police who shoot somebody for no reason at all. They just won't, they didn't see anything, they don't know anything, and they're not going to testify. In prison, I usually, when I investigate a case of sexual abuse. In Michigan, we had a very big case, the Neal case, where there were 500 women who claimed to have been sexually abused by staff. They won $100 million in settlement 5 years ago. One of the women took the stand in court, and it's incredible to see these women who are just abused right and left. They were abused before they came in, they were abused as children, they were abused in prison. Take the stand and describe what happened. She's in prison, and a male officer leads her into an area of the prison that prisoners are not allowed to be in. They pass a sergeant sitting at a desk at the line between the prisoners area and the staff area where prisoners are not supposed to be. And the officer who's leading her there, and she doesn't know why he's leading her there, stops and chats with the sergeant while she's standing there. Then he proceeds to take her down a hall, into a closet, and rape her viciously. He leaves her there. She puts herself together as best she can and starts walking back down the hall. And the sergeant sitting at the desk, "Hey, what are you doing here? Prisoners aren't allowed in this area." That sergeant didn't report what happened. The sergeant didn't testify when it came to the civil action that I was an expert for. So that's the blue code. All right, now I'm saying that one of my premises is what goes on in prison is a mirror of what goes on out here. The issue of what men want to do about the pervasiveness of sexual harassment in the workplace, in government, in schools, is a big question in front of us. So there's a parallel, for instance, of how I think the prison is a mirror of what's going on in society. Race is another example. I mentioned that 59% of people in solitary confinement in New York are African American. It's only 13 or 16%. I think New York has 16%, California and other big states have 13% African Americans. So how do 59% of the solitary confinement population get to be African American? I think we need to look at that, do a micro-analysis of that. In prison, the toxic masculinity I've talked about is this. You have to be tough to survive in prison. There is a male code. The male code, by the way, is exactly the same as the officer's code. You have to buff up. And the reason you're buffing up is that you have to look like if someone attacks you, they're going to get hurt. You don't have to hurt anybody, although if someone challenges you to fight, you have to fight and you have to do what the prisoners say, make a showing. That is, you have to at least fight well enough so the other guy is hurt and people aren't just going to pick on you and rape you. So that's part of being competent in prison in that culture. I don't know if any of you saw The Night Of, a mini-series on television. There's a character there, what is his name? Roz, I think, is the character. And he goes into prison as a slight young man, kind of timid, and he gets in a lot of trouble, and he gets persecuted. And he starts a line with sort of a thug who runs, this is a section of Rikers Island here, And he gets allied with him, the guy gives him protection, he starts buffing up, he starts doing jobs for his friend. He starts becoming a prison tough. And the whole series is about how